My name is Cass Ellery, and by the time I turned 23 my grandmother had already been dead for 8 months. I know that sounds like the beginning of a grief story. It isn't. It's the beginning of something colder than grief, something that starts with a family dinner and ends with a document that nobody knew I had kept. Let me tell you what happened the night I found out. I was sitting at my aunt's kitchen table in Mill Haven, Tennessee, eating pot roast I didn't taste, listening to my Uncle Gavin talk about settling the estate like it was a project he was managing at work. Efficient. Organized. Already halfway done. He kept using the word finalized, and every time he said it something in my chest pulled tight like a stitch being drawn too fast through fabric that was never meant to tear. I smiled. I nodded. I passed the bread basket when asked. And the whole time, underneath the table, my fingers were pressing into my palms so hard I left marks in my own skin. Because 2 weeks earlier, I had found something in a shoebox at the back of my grandmother's closet. Something Gavin didn't know about. Something nobody in that room knew about. And I had not said a single word to anyone. I want to take you back to the beginning because to understand what I did, you have to understand what she built, and why she built it so quietly that even the people closest to her never saw it coming. My grandmother's name was Loretta Ellery. She was 71 years old when she died, and she had spent the last 40 of those years running a small alterations and tailoring shop on Clement Street in downtown Mill Haven. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the kind of business that gets written up in local papers or earns anyone a standing ovation at a Chamber of Commerce dinner. But it was hers fully and completely, and she ran it with the kind of precision and quiet dignity that made people drive 40 minutes out of their way just to have her hem a dress or take in a jacket. Her regulars didn't just come back because she was good. They came back because she remembered things. She remembered that Mrs. Patton preferred her sleeves a half-inch longer than standard. She remembered that old Mr. Callister's left shoulder sat higher than his right. She paid attention in a way that people felt even when they couldn't name it. I grew up in that shop. Not metaphorically. Literally. My mother left when I was 4 and my father, Loretta's son, was not what anyone would call a consistent presence. So from the age of 4 until I was old enough to drive myself home, I spent most of my afternoons sitting on a stool behind the counter, doing homework while Loretta worked. I learned to thread a needle before I learned to ride a bike. I learned how to talk to difficult customers before I learned how to parallel park. She taught me everything she knew not because she had a grand plan for me, but because she believed that knowledge was the only thing nobody could ever repossess. Gavin was her other son. Younger than my father by 6 years, smoother in a way that made people trust him before they had any real reason to. He sold insurance for a living and had a particular talent for making complicated things sound simple and simple things sound impossible, depending on which version served him better in the moment. He had a wife named Patrice and 2 kids and a house on the nicer side of Mill Haven, and he came to family dinners exactly as often as it benefited him to appear present. He was good at appearances. He had been practicing his whole life. My father, Dennis, was different. He wasn't calculating the way Gavin was. He was just absent, the kind of man who meant well in theory and disappeared in practice. He showed up at Loretta's shop maybe 4 times a year, usually when he needed something, and left with whatever she gave him because she could never stop loving him even when he handed her every reason in the world to try. I was the one who stayed. I was the one who drove Loretta to her doctor's appointments when her hip got bad in her late 60s. I was the one who helped her with her books, moved her client records onto a proper computer system, and sat with her on Sunday mornings eating biscuits and watching the birds fight over her backyard feeder. I wasn't doing it to earn anything. I want to be honest about that. I was doing it because she was the only person in my life who had ever made me feel like I genuinely belonged somewhere, like my presence was not just tolerated but actually wanted. When she got sick in the spring of the year I turned 22, I moved into her spare room without anyone asking me to. I took a remote job doing data entry so I could work around her schedule and her needs. I learned her medications, her routines, which nights she couldn't sleep and needed someone to sit with her in the kitchen while she drank chamomile tea and talked about her life before any of us existed in it. Those late nights are some of the most important conversations I have ever had, and I did not know it at the time. Gavin visited 4 times during those 8 months. I counted not out of bitterness, just because I noticed. Loretta died on a Tuesday morning in October. I was in the room. I was holding her hand. By Thursday afternoon, Gavin was already on the phone with an estate attorney. I want to tell you what I found in that shoebox because it changes everything that comes after. 3 weeks before Loretta died, on a Sunday morning when she was having a better day, she asked me to bring down the brown box from the top shelf of her closet. I thought it was photographs. She liked looking through old pictures on her good days, running her thumb along the edges like she was trying to feel the texture of the memory. But when I set the box on the bed beside her and she opened it, there were no photos inside. There was a folder, a small sealed envelope with tape across the flap, and a USB drive with a strip of masking tape that had 3 words written on it in her handwriting. Cass only. She held the folder in both hands for a moment without opening it, just held it, and then she looked at me with the kind of steadiness that only comes from a decision made long ago and never second-guessed. She told me she had done something years back, something she had never told either of her sons about, because she already knew what they would do with the information the moment they had it. She told me the shop was not just a shop. She told me to read everything in the folder carefully, and to not say a word to anyone until I had spoken to a woman named Beverly Trout, whose business card was paper-clipped to the inside cover. She told me one more thing before she closed her eyes again. She said, "The thing about this family, Cass, is that everyone waits for the moment they can take something. You're the only one who ever just gave." I did not fully understand what she meant. Not yet. I took the folder. I took the USB drive. I slipped them into my own bag without a word to anyone. 3 weeks later she was gone, and Gavin was at the dinner table with his organized timeline and his word, finalized, and his pot roast sitting untouched while he talked like a man who had already written the ending to a story he hadn't actually read. Here is what I knew by the night of that family dinner that nobody else in that room knew. Loretta's shop on Clement Street was not just a business operating out of a leased space. 6 years ago she had quietly purchased the building outright, paying off the remaining mortgage balance with money she had been setting aside for over a decade. The building, which sat on a corner lot in one of Millhaven's oldest commercial blocks, had been appraised the previous year at just under $380,000. It housed not only her tailoring shop on the ground floor but 2 small rental apartments on the second floor that had been generating steady monthly income for years. None of that was in the estate paperwork Gavin had been circulating. Because Loretta had transferred ownership of the building into a designated beneficiary arrangement 6 years earlier, structured in a way that passed it directly to me outside of the general estate, bypassing probate entirely. Beverly Trout, whose card was clipped inside that folder, was the attorney who had drawn up the arrangement. The USB drive held digital copies of every document, every filing, and every recorded deed. Gavin had been operating under the assumption that the building was still a leased space with no significant asset value attached to it. He had already told the family that the shop would need to be cleared out and that the business assets, the equipment, the client list, the sewing inventory, would be liquidated as part of the estate settlement. He had a number in mind. He had a buyer in mind too, a commercial property investor from Nashville named Darren Foss who had been quietly circling that block for 2 years waiting for an opportunity. What Gavin did not know, what nobody at that table knew, was that the building he was planning to hand over had belonged to me on paper for 6 years. And I had every document to prove it. I sat at that dinner table and watched Gavin explain his timeline with the calm confidence of a man who had already won, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not rage. Not panic. Just a very quiet, very steady sense of purpose. The kind that only comes from knowing you are holding the last piece of something, and that when the right moment arrives, you simply set it down and let it do what it was always meant to do. Loretta had planned for exactly this moment. She had seen it coming long before I even knew there was anything to see. And in the morning I was going to call Beverly Trout. I called Beverly Trout the morning after that dinner. It was early, barely past 7, and I was sitting in my car in the driveway of Loretta's house because I didn't want to risk being overheard inside. The street was quiet. A neighbor was walking a dog down the sidewalk. A garbage truck was working its way up the block. Normal Tuesday sounds in a world that felt anything but normal to me. Beverly picked up on the second ring. Her voice was unhurried and precise, the kind of voice that had delivered difficult information to enough people that it no longer required a warm-up. She told me she had been expecting my call. She told me Loretta had instructed her to wait until I reached out on my own, that she didn't want Beverly contacting me directly because she wanted me to find the folder first, to read everything, to sit with it before I spoke to anyone. That was so completely Loretta that I almost laughed. Even at the end she was teaching me to prepare before I acted. Beverly confirmed everything in the folder. The building at 412 Clement Street had been transferred into a beneficiary deed arrangement 6 years ago. Under Tennessee law, a beneficiary deed allows a property owner to designate who receives real property upon their death, and it transfers outside of probate entirely. It doesn't require the beneficiary to sign anything in advance. It doesn't require anyone else's approval. Loretta had signed the deed, had it witnessed and notarized, and had it recorded with the county clerk's office. It was a public record. It had been sitting in the county database for 6 years, invisible to everyone who never thought to look. The building was already mine. It had been mine since the moment Loretta died. There was nothing to contest, nothing to petition, nothing to wait on. I just had to make sure nobody did anything with the property before I formally stepped forward. Beverly told me to come into her office that afternoon and bring the folder and the USB drive. She would walk me through the next steps, which mostly involved making sure Gavin and anyone working with him understood exactly what the chain of title said before they did something that couldn't be undone. I drove to Beverly's office after lunch. She worked out of a small building on Hartwell Avenue, the kind of office that looked like it had been there for 30 years and intended to stay for 30 more. Dark wood furniture. Framed diplomas on the wall. A receptionist named Clara who offered me coffee before I even sat down. Beverly herself was in her mid-60s, compact and direct, with reading glasses she wore pushed up on her forehead until she actually needed them. She had clearly known Loretta well. There was a photo of the two of them on the credenza behind her desk, laughing at something, both squinting into what looked like afternoon sun. She laid out the situation without softening it. Gavin had already been in contact with a commercial real estate broker about liquidating the business assets at the Clement Street property. The broker, a man named Roy Sims, had sent a letter to the estate address indicating he had a buyer prepared to move quickly on the ground floor commercial space and was ready to begin the process of clearing out the contents for resale. Beverly had intercepted the letter because Loretta had listed Beverly's address as the notice address for all property correspondence years ago. Another quiet precaution Loretta had built in without telling anyone. Roy Sims did not know that his client, Darren Foss, was attempting to acquire a building that was no longer part of the estate. Gavin did not know it either. And Dennis, my father, who had apparently been looped in at some point in the past 2 weeks and had agreed to whatever Gavin proposed without asking a single question, definitely did not know it. None of them had checked the title. None of them had pulled the county records. They had assumed the building was an asset of the estate the same way people assume things when nobody challenges them. That was the first moment I felt something shift from quiet resolve into something sharper. Not anger exactly. More like clarity. The kind you feel when you realize the people who were supposed to protect you didn't even bother to do the basic work of understanding what they were taking. Beverly and I spent 2 hours going through everything that afternoon. She walked me through the beneficiary deed line by line. She pulled up the county recorder's database on her desktop and showed me the filing, time-stamped, witnessed, legitimate in every detail. She explained that once she sent a formal notice to Gavin's attorney identifying me as the titled owner of the Clement Street property, any further attempt to liquidate or transfer assets connected to the building would constitute an unauthorized disposition of property that didn't belong to the estate. In plain language, if Gavin proceeded after being notified, he wouldn't just be wrong. He would be acting in a way that carried real legal consequences. I asked her when she planned to send the notice. She looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "That's your call, Cass. Loretta wanted you to be the one who decided the timing. Not me." I thought about that on the drive back to Loretta's house. The timing. Loretta had always talked about timing the way other people talk about weather. Not something you control, but something you read correctly and decide how to move around. She used to say that a hem finished too early puckers. You have to let the fabric settle first. I had never fully understood what she meant by that until I was sitting in my car outside her house at 5 in the afternoon, watching the light go orange through her front window, thinking about how much she had built in silence so that I would have something to stand on. I decided to wait 3 more days. Not because I was afraid. Because I wanted to know exactly how far Gavin intended to go before I stopped him. Beverly agreed it was reasonable as long as no physical transfer of property occurred. She would monitor the county records daily and alert me immediately if anything was filed. Those 3 days taught me more about my family than the previous 2 decades had. On the first evening, Gavin called me. Friendly voice, the insurance salesman warmth he turned on and off like a faucet. He told me he knew this had all been a hard time, that losing Loretta had been difficult for everyone, and that he just wanted to make sure we handled things as a family and moved forward together. He used the word together 4 times in a conversation that lasted 8 minutes. He asked me if I had any questions about the estate process. I said no. He said good because he wanted everything settled quickly so everyone could have some closure. Closure. That was his word for $380,000. On the second day my father called. His voice was different from Gavin's. Less polished. He sounded like a man who had been told what to say and was trying to remember it. He told me Gavin had everything under control and that the money from the shop liquidation would be split fairly. He said he knew it wasn't a lot but that it would give us all something to move forward with. He said he was sorry things had been hard. He said he wished he had been around more. That last part landed differently than he probably intended it to. He wished he had been around more. He was telling me this now on a phone call designed to smooth the path towards selling something that had already been given to me. I told him I appreciated him calling. Kept my voice even. I had nothing to gain from telling him what I knew before Beverly's notice went out. On the third day I drove past the shop. I hadn't been inside since the week after the funeral, when I had gone to water Loretta's plants and found that someone had already been through the back office. The filing cabinet was open. The desk drawers had been gone through, not ransacked, but searched in that careful way people search when they're looking for something specific and don't want it to be obvious. I had noticed it then and said nothing. Now driving past I saw Roy Sim's car parked in front. He was standing on the sidewalk talking to a man I didn't recognize, both of them looking up at the building, and the man I didn't recognize had a clipboard. They were already measuring. They were already moving. Gavin hadn't waited for the notice because he didn't know there was going to be one. He thought the path was clear. He thought the only thing between him and a fast sale was time, and he was running out of patience for it. I pulled over half a block down and called Beverly from the curb. She answered before the second ring. I told her what I was looking at. She was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said, "I'll send the notice this afternoon. Certified mail and email. His attorney gets a copy simultaneously. After today, anything they touch is a problem they created for themselves." I stayed parked on that street for a while after I hung up. I watched Roy Sims walk back to his car and drive away. I watched the man with the clipboard take one more look at the building, write something down and leave. I watched the front window of the shop, the same window where Loretta had hung a small handwritten sign for 40 years that said alterations while you wait. The sign was still there. I don't know why that detail hit me as hard as it did. Maybe because it was so ordinary. Maybe because it was so completely her. A woman who built something quiet and permanent and true, and then waited some more and trusted that the right person would show up to finish what she started. Beverly's notice went out at 4:17 that afternoon. By morning, Gavin would know exactly what Loretta had done. And exactly what I had known all along. Gavin called at 7:43 the next morning. I know the exact time because I was already awake, already dressed, already sitting at Loretta's kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of me. I had not slept well. Not from fear but from the particular kind of alertness that comes when you know something is about to break open and you cannot stop the clock no matter how still you sit. His number lit up my screen and I let it ring twice before I answered. He didn't bother with pleasantries this time. The insurance salesman warmth was completely gone, stripped away the moment Beverly's notice had landed in his attorney's inbox the afternoon before. What he sounded like instead was a man who had walked into a room he thought he knew and found that every wall had been moved 2 feet to the left. Disoriented. Recalculating. And underneath all of that, something I had to sit with for a moment to identify properly. He was embarrassed. Not sorry. Just embarrassed, the way people get when they've been caught assuming something they should have taken the time to verify. "What is this letter from a Beverly Trout?" he said. Not a question. A demand wearing a question's clothes. I told him it was exactly what it said it was. A formal notice identifying me as the titled owner of the Clement Street property pursuant to a beneficiary deed recorded 6 years ago. Silence followed, the kind that has genuine weight to it. Then he said, "Your grandmother never mentioned any deed." I told him that was correct, she hadn't mentioned it to anyone, which was entirely her choice to make since it was her property and her decision and nobody else's. He told me he didn't believe the document was legitimate. I told him the county recorder's office had the filing if he wanted to pull it himself, and that Beverly's contact information was printed on the notice if his attorney had questions. He hung up without saying goodbye. Within the hour I had a call from a man who introduced himself as Stuart Feld, Gavin's attorney. His tone was professionally neutral in the particular way that attorneys are when they are quietly deciding whether something is worth fighting or whether the evidence is already too clean to bother. He asked me to walk him through my understanding of the deed arrangement. I told him Beverly would call him directly and that she had all the documentation. He said that would be fine. Then he asked me one more question before ending the call, and it was the question that told me everything I needed to know about which direction things were heading. He asked whether the deed had been properly witnessed and notarized at the time it was executed. I told him yes, by 2 independent witnesses and a licensed notary, all documented with the original notarized copy held in Beverly's files along with the recorded county filing. He thanked me and ended the call. He wasn't going to fight it. I could hear it in the way he framed that last question. He was already checking the box in his head that said this one is airtight. Advise your client to stand down and find a different argument. What happened next is the part one hadn't fully anticipated, not because I was legally unprepared, but because I had underestimated how many moves Gavin still had left in him before he finally accepted a wall he could not push through. 2 days after Beverly's notice went out, my father called. This one was different from the careful, scripted check-in he had done earlier in the week. Dennis was talking faster than usual and his voice had that particular strained quality it gets when someone has said something to him that he hasn't fully processed yet but feels compelled to pass along. He told me Gavin had called him that morning and explained that I had apparently done something with the shop building, that I had been working with a lawyer behind the family's back, and that the whole estate was now going to be tied up in a legal mess because of choices I had made. Because of me. I let that framing sit in the air for a moment before I responded. I asked my father calmly whether Gavin had mentioned that the deed had been filed 6 years ago by Loretta herself, before anyone in this conversation was sick or dying or calculating their portion of anything. He went quiet. I asked whether Gavin had mentioned that Loretta had made a legal, documented, properly witnessed decision about her own property entirely of her own free will, and that referring to it as a mess of my making was roughly equivalent to calling a locked door a break-in. He had no answer for that. My father rarely had answers when the facts were laid out plainly. He had absences where answers should have been, and that had always been its own kind of problem separate from everything else, one I had long since stopped waiting on him to fix. He said he'd talk to Gavin. I told him to take his time. Beverly called me that Thursday afternoon and her voice had the particular measured quality that told me something new had developed and she wanted me to hear it clearly before reacting. She told me Roy Sims had filed a notice of intent to claim a broker's commission against the Clement Street property. Sims was arguing that he had procured a ready and willing buyer in Darren Foss prior to the title dispute surfacing, and that he was therefore owed compensation for services rendered regardless of whether the sale ever closed. The commission he was claiming was 6% of the agreed sale price, which Foss and Gavin had apparently settled on at $310,000. A figure well below the building's actual appraised value. 6% of that number was $18,600, and Sims was arguing it constituted a lien against the property itself. Beverly was measured about it. She said the claim would almost certainly fail because no one with any legal authority over the building had ever signed a listing agreement with Sims, and you cannot earn a commission on the unauthorized sale of someone else's property. But it would take time and some legal cost to resolve cleanly. And that was clearly the point. Someone was trying to make this expensive enough that I would want it to simply go away. Then she told me about Greta. Greta was the longer term of the 2 upstairs tenants, a woman in her late 50s who had rented the larger apartment for 11 years. She had received a letter on what appeared to be a state letterhead informing her that her lease would not be renewed and that she was required to vacate the premises within 60 days. She had called the phone number printed on the letter twice and reached no one. She had eventually walked down to the shop, found it locked, and slipped a handwritten note through the mail slot asking what was happening and who she should speak to. I drove to Clement Street that same afternoon. Greta met me at the top of the exterior staircase with the careful expression of someone who has been given uncertain news and is still waiting to find out exactly how bad it is. I introduced myself and told her who I was. I told her the building belonged to me under a beneficiary deed her landlord had filed years ago, and that no one claiming to represent the estate had any authority to terminate her tenancy. The letter she received had not come from anyone with a legal right to send it, and she was under no obligation to vacate. She held my eyes for a moment. Then she said your grandmother told me once a few years back that she had made arrangements so this place would stay in good hands. I assumed she just meant she had a will. I figured it was the kind of thing people say when they want you not to worry. I told Greta it wasn't just something she said. I want to stay with that moment because it mattered to me in a way I hadn't expected. Loretta had not only built the legal structure. She had thought about the people living inside it. Greta had been in that apartment for 11 years because Loretta had kept the rent fair, kept the building maintained, and had never once treated her like a number on a ledger. The shop downstairs had served the same block in the same neighborhood for 4 decades. These were not assets awaiting liquidation. They were a community Loretta had tended the same way she tended everything in her life, with patience and precision and genuine care for what endured. Gavin had looked at all of it and seen a transaction. That gap between those two ways of seeing was not subtle. Beverly called the following morning with the results of her inquiry into the eviction letter. She told me it had been drafted on estate letterhead that Gavin had apparently assembled himself from a template, unsigned by any attorney, unauthorized by the probate court, and sent to a tenant of a property that had never legally been part of the estate. She used a specific phrase when she summarized it and I wrote it down. She said it was an unauthorized act with potential civil liability attached to it. Gavin had sent a fabricated eviction notice to a tenant in a building he did not own. Beverly filed 2 formal responses the following Monday. One contesting Roy Sims' commission claim on the grounds that no valid listing agreement had ever existed. One placing Gavin's attorney on notice regarding the unauthorized tenant communication and its legal implications. Stuart Feld's written reply arrived within 24 hours. It was 3 sentences. His client would not be pursuing any further action regarding the Clement Street property. His client acknowledged the beneficiary deed as the controlling instrument of title. His client wished to resolve all outstanding matters without litigation. That was it. 3 sentences and Gavin was done. He just hadn't told our family yet. And I had decided I was going to be the one to do it. I asked my father to meet me for coffee. Not Gavin. Just Dennis. Just the 2 of us at a diner on Route 9 called Hattie's that had been there since before either of us was born. Vinyl booths, ceiling fans turning slow overhead, coffee that came in thick ceramic mugs without anyone asking. I had been going there with Loretta since I was small enough that my feet didn't reach the floor from the booth seat. Dennis arrived 5 minutes late, which for him counted as on time. He looked tired in a way that had become permanent somewhere in his 50s, the kind of tired that isn't fixed by sleep. He slid into the booth across from me, ordered coffee without looking at the menu, and folded his hands on the table the way he does when he's preparing himself for something uncomfortable. I didn't ease into it. I told him everything. Not the legal summary. The whole thing. I told him about the shoebox. I told him about the Sunday morning when Loretta showed me the folder, about the USB drive with her handwriting on the masking tape, about Beverly Trout and the 6-year-old beneficiary deed sitting quietly in the county recorder's database the entire time Gavin was making phone calls and scheduling brokers and drafting estate paperwork for a building that had never been part of any estate. I told him about Roy Sims standing on the sidewalk with a clipboard. I told him about the letter Greta received. I told him about Stuart Feld's 3-sentence reply and what it meant. Dennis listened without interrupting, which surprised me. He's not usually a quiet listener. He usually fills silences the way uncomfortable people do, with small sounds and redirections and subject changes that steer away from anything requiring him to sit still in a hard feeling. But he sat still this time. He kept his eyes on his coffee mug and he listened to all of it. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "She never told me any of this." His voice was not angry. It was something smaller than angry and harder to name. I said, "I know." He said, "She left you the building and never said a word to me." I said that was correct. He turned his mug in a slow circle on the table. Then he asked the question I had been waiting for, the one that told me whether this conversation was going to go somewhere real or whether it was going to collapse into the same comfortable avoidance it always did. He asked, "Did she have a reason not to tell me?" I looked at my father. I thought about all the Sunday mornings I had spent at Loretta's kitchen table and how many of those mornings she had waited for Dennis to call and he hadn't. I thought about all the times she had covered for him with money he didn't pay back and patience he didn't earn. I thought about the 4 visits in 8 months while I slept in the spare room and managed her medications and sat with her at 2 in the morning when she couldn't rest. I said, "Dad, I think you know the answer to that." He didn't argue. He just nodded once slowly and stared at his coffee. That small nod cost him something. I could see it cost him something. And I didn't press further because there was nothing more to gain from it. Some reckonings are private. The point wasn't to make him feel worse. The point was to make sure he understood what had actually happened so that when Gavin came to him next, as I knew Gavin would, Dennis would have the full picture. I told him one more thing before we left Hattie's. I told him Gavin's attorney had already conceded. The commission claim from Sims would be contested and would fail. The building was legally mine, cleanly and completely, and there was nothing left to challenge. I told him this not to gloat but because I needed Dennis to stop being the person Gavin used as a relay. Every time Gavin called my father and sent him to me with a softened version of whatever argument he hadn't been able to make himself, it just created more noise without changing anything. It was over. The sooner Dennis understood that, the sooner we could all stop pretending otherwise. He nodded again. Paid for both coffees without being asked. Walked out ahead of me into the gray morning and stood on the sidewalk for a moment with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at nothing in particular. Then he got in his car and drove away. I stood there and watched him go and felt something I didn't expect. Not resolution. Just a specific kind of sadness, the kind that comes from finally understanding that a person isn't going to be what you needed them to be, and realizing you made your peace with that a long time ago without noticing. Gavin came to Loretta's house that Saturday. I hadn't invited him. He didn't knock. He used the key he had kept from years ago, the one Loretta had given both her sons when she first moved into the house on Birch Street, and he let himself in through the front door while I was in the kitchen making lunch. I heard the door and then his footsteps in the hallway, and then he was standing in the kitchen doorway in a pressed shirt with his arms crossed and the particular expression of a man who has rehearsed what he's about to say and wants to get through it before he loses his nerve. I set down the knife I was using and turned around and waited. He started with money. That was where Gavin always started because money was the vocabulary he was most fluent in. He told me the building was worth more than I understood, that I was 23 years old with no experience managing commercial property, that the upstairs apartments alone were going to require maintenance and tenant management and liability insurance and accounting, and that without the resources to handle all of that properly I was going to run it into the ground within 2 years. He said Darren Foss's offer, even at $310,000, was a fair price for something I had no idea how to keep. He said the practical thing, the smart thing, the thing Loretta would have wanted for me, was to take the money, pay off my debts, start my life with a real foundation instead of a problem I wasn't equipped to handle. I let him finish. I gave him the full courtesy of finishing. Then I asked him a single question. I asked him when, in all the years he had known Loretta, he had ever seen her do something impractical. He opened his mouth and closed it again. I told him that Loretta had run a business by herself for 40 years. That she had purchased a building outright without a loan. That she had structured a legal arrangement sophisticated enough that it bypassed probate entirely, went undetected for 6 years, and survived his attorney's review in under 24 hours. I told him that the woman he was describing as sentimental and impractical had quietly outplanned everyone in this family while running her shop and raising the people who were now standing in her kitchen arguing over what she left behind. Gavin was quiet for a moment. Then he shifted. That was what he did when one argument ran out of road. He shifted to a different one without acknowledging that the first had failed. He said Loretta was his mother too. He said he had a right to something from her estate. He said watching me walk away with the most valuable thing she owned while he got nothing felt like being cut out of his own family, and that whatever legal arrangement existed, the spirit of it wasn't fair. I had thought about this moment. I had thought about it since the night of the dinner at Patrice's kitchen table, and I had decided what I wanted to say when it arrived. I didn't want to be cruel, but I also wasn't going to soften something that needed to be said plainly. I told him that Loretta had left him things. I had read the full estate documents Beverly had walked me through, and there was a savings account, personal jewelry, the furniture from the house, items of real and sentimental value that had passed through the estate in the normal way. What she had chosen not to leave him was the building. And she had made that choice 6 years before she died, with a clear mind and a licensed attorney, and she had made it for reasons she understood better than either of us did standing in her kitchen now. I said she didn't cut you out, Gavin. She made a decision about what she trusted you with. Those are different things. The silence that followed was the longest one of the whole ordeal. He stood in the doorway and looked at me, and I looked back at him, and neither of us said anything for what felt like a full minute. Then something in his posture changed. Not softened exactly, More like the tension that had been holding him upright for the past 2 weeks finally stopped having anything to hold against. He said, "I need to think." I said, "Take the time you need." He walked back down the hallway and let himself out the same way he had come in. The front door clicked shut behind him and the house went quiet. I stood at the kitchen counter for a while after that. Outside a car passed. A dog barked twice and stopped. Ordinary sounds. I thought about what Loretta would have made of all of it, whether she would have been surprised by any of it or whether she had seen this exact scene playing out in her mind when she sat across from Beverly Trout 6 years ago and signed her name to a document nobody else knew existed. I didn't think she would have been surprised. I thought she had known exactly what she was building and exactly what it would need to withstand. What I didn't know yet was that the hardest conversation was still ahead of me, and it wasn't with Gavin. The hardest conversation was with Patrice. Gavin's wife called me 4 days after he showed up unannounced at the house. I had not expected to hear from her directly. Patrice and I had never been particularly close, not unfriendly, just occupying different orbits at family gatherings, exchanging pleasantries that filled space without building anything real. She was organized and capable and had always struck me as someone who kept her opinions close and her calendar full. When her name appeared on my screen that Wednesday evening, I almost didn't answer. I answered. She asked if I had time to talk. Her voice was different from Gavin's, different from Dennis's, different from any voice I had dealt with over the past several weeks. There was no strategy in it and no rehearsed argument. She sounded like a woman who had spent several days sitting alone with something difficult and had finally decided she needed to say it out loud to the person it most concerned. She told me Gavin had not slept properly since Stuart Feld's reply came back. She said he had been sitting with it in a way she hadn't seen him sit with anything before, not defensive the way he usually was when a deal fell through, but genuinely unsettled somewhere deeper than his usual frustration reached. She said she had read Beverly's notice herself after he left it on the kitchen counter one evening, and that she had looked up beneficiary deeds in Tennessee that same night, and that by the time she finished reading she understood exactly what Loretta had done and exactly why it was unassailable. She said she had sat at the kitchen table for a long time afterward and not said anything to Gavin about what she had found, because she needed to decide first what she thought about it herself. Then she said something I genuinely had not anticipated. She said, "I want you to know that I didn't know about the eviction letter Gavin sent to your tenant. I found out only when you told Dennis and Dennis came back to Gavin with it." She paused long enough that I could tell she was choosing her next words carefully. "I want you to know that I told him it was wrong. Not complicated. Not a gray area. Just wrong." I sat with that for a moment before I responded. Patrice had 2 kids in that house and a mortgage and a life built alongside a man who had just spent 2 weeks trying to acquire something that was never his to touch. Whatever she felt about Gavin privately was her own business, but saying what she said to me directly cost her something real, and I recognized that and respected it. I told her I appreciated her saying it. I meant every word of that. She asked me one question before she ended the call. She asked whether I intended to pursue anything further against Gavin personally, beyond the legal matter that had already been resolved by his attorney's concession. I told her no. Beverly had advised me that I could potentially pursue civil damages related specifically to the unauthorized eviction letter, given that it constituted communication to a tenant of a property Gavin had no authority over. But the building was already won, the title was clean, and I had no interest in spending the next 2 years in litigation over a matter that was already settled. The situation was closed on my end as long as nothing further was attempted. She exhaled slowly. He said thank you. She said she hoped that in time things could be different between all of us. I said I hope so too, and I said it with the honest uncertainty that phrase deserves when the damage is still recent enough that you can feel the edges of it when you move the wrong way. After I hung up, I sat in Loretta's living room for a long time without turning on any lights. The room went dark gradually as the evening came through the windows, and I let it. I looked at the chair Loretta had always kept by the front window, the one with the worn armrest where she rested her elbow when she read. I thought about the fact that she had sat in that same chair and known exactly what she was building and exactly who it would need to protect itself against. She had not drafted that arrangement in fear or anger. She had drafted it the same way she did everything, calmly, thoroughly, with full knowledge of who the people in her life were and what each of them would reach for when they thought no one was watching. I did not feel victorious sitting there. I want to be clear about that. Victory is the wrong word for surviving something that should never have needed to happen in the first place. Beverly called the following week with the final resolution on Roy Sims' commission claim. It had been formally rejected by the court on the grounds that no valid listing agreement had ever existed between Sims and any party who held legal authority over the property. Sims had argued that Gavin's representation of himself as a rightful heir constituted sufficient authorization, but the court found that representation without actual legal standing creates no enforceable contract. The claim was dismissed without appeal. Darren Foss's attorney sent a brief letter releasing any interest in the property and acknowledging that the sale would not be proceeding. Beverly told me the building was now fully clear of encumbrances, pending claims and title disputes of any kind. She also told me something I had asked her about a few days earlier, something I had been turning over quietly and needed to hear from someone who had actually been in the room with Loretta. I had asked whether Loretta ever doubted the arrangement, whether she had ever wavered or wondered if she was being too careful or too private about all of it. Beverly was quiet for a moment. Then she said that about 2 years after the deed was filed, Loretta had called her and asked one question. She asked whether she should tell Dennis. Not Gavin. Just Dennis. Beverly said Loretta had taken several weeks to think about it before calling back with her answer. The answer was no. Loretta told Beverly she had thought carefully about who Dennis was when life was easy versus who he became when money entered the picture, and she had decided the two were different enough that the answer was no. I nodded at that even though Beverly couldn't see me. I understood it without needing it explained further. In the months that followed, I kept the building on Clement Street. Not as a passive landlord holding an asset, but as someone who had been handed a responsibility and intended to take it seriously. I spent the first several weeks going through the ground floor carefully, sorting through 40 years of a working life in a way that required patience and attention. Greta helped me on Saturdays. She had known Loretta as a neighbor and a landlord for over a decade, and she filled in details I hadn't known, pieces of Loretta's story from before I existed in it. I learned that Loretta had arrived in Millhaven at 26 with 2 small children, a sewing machine and very little else. I learned that the Clement Street building had been empty for almost 2 years before she first saw it, and that the man who owned it had told her the space wasn't right for a retail business. I learned she had disagreed with him politely and persistently until he rented it to her anyway. And I learned that it had taken her 11 years of careful, deliberate saving before she was able to buy the building outright, and that she had never told a single person when she did it because she already understood what that information would set in motion. That last piece sat with me for a long time after Greta told me. Loretta had done something genuinely significant and then protected it by keeping it entirely to herself. Not out of secrecy for its own sake. Out of the clear-eyed understanding that certain people, once they know what you have, stop seeing you and start seeing an opportunity. I thought about the USB drive with the masking tape. I thought about the business card in the folder. I thought about a Sunday morning when Loretta handed me everything she had built and trusted me to know what to do with it when the time came. That fall I converted the ground floor into 4 small studio spaces, rentable by the month, for people doing work that requires a quiet room and a reliable address. A seamstress leased one of them, which felt like something Loretta would have appreciated without making a fuss about it. Greta stayed in her apartment upstairs, same lease, same fair rent. Beverly visited the building once in November and stood in the doorway of the ground floor looking at the studios in the afternoon light coming through the front window, and she said she would have liked this. I said I know, and the two of us stood there for a moment in a comfortable silence that didn't need anything added to it. Then Beverly put on her coat and went back to Hartwell Avenue, and I stood alone in the building Loretta had worked in for 40 years and thought about what it really means to inherit something. Not the legal definition. The actual one. It means someone studied you carefully over a long period of time and made a decision. Not about what you would do with money or how you would spend a windfall. About who you were when no one was offering you anything. About whether you were the kind of person who showed up before there was anything in it for you. And then they built something durable and left it in a place they knew you would find it, and trusted that you would know what it meant and what it was asking of you. I found it. I understood it. I'm still honoring it. And every morning when I unlock the front door of 412 Clement Street, I think about a woman who built something lasting out of nothing alone, without asking anyone's permission, and who knew exactly what she was doing every single step of the way. 2 years later, I am sitting on the front steps of 412 Clement Street on a Tuesday morning in early October, drinking coffee from the same ceramic mug I found in Loretta's kitchen cabinet the week after she died. The air has that particular quality it gets in Millhaven in the fall, cool and faintly sweet, carrying just enough wood smoke from somewhere down the block to make you feel like the season actually means it this time. The seamstress in Studio 2 arrived before I did this morning. I could hear her machine running through the front window when I pulled into the lot, that familiar steady rhythm that used to be the sound of the whole building when Loretta was alive. Her name is June and she specializes in bridal alterations and she has more clients than she can comfortably manage, which is a good problem to be in the business of having. She brings me coffee sometimes from the place on Hartwell Avenue. I bring her the good pastries from the bakery 2 blocks over on Fridays. We don't talk much but we understand each other well, which is its own kind of language. The other 3 studios are all occupied. A graphic designer who works odd hours and occasionally leaves the lights on until 2 in the morning. A woman named Therese who runs a small bookkeeping practice and has more plants on her windowsill than any space that size should reasonably support. And a retired schoolteacher named Mr. Aldous who rents the smallest studio 3 days a week to write what he describes only as a very long project, and whom Greta has apparently been having coffee with on Wednesday mornings for the past 6 months. I noticed and said nothing because some things are not my business, and also because it would have made Loretta quietly happy. Greta is still upstairs. She repainted her apartment last spring, the first time she had done anything significant to it in years. She told me afterward that it was the first time she had invested in a place she actually believed she would be allowed to stay in long enough for it to matter. I didn't have a response adequate to the weight of that, so I told her the color was a good choice, which it was. A warm terracotta, she said, reminded her of somewhere she visited once in New Mexico. She laughed when she said it. Greta laughs more easily than she used to, and I take that as a sign of something settling properly into place. The broker's commission claim was formally closed 14 months ago. Roy Sims relocated his practice to a different county, which Beverly mentioned without commentary. Darren Foss's development company eventually purchased a vacant lot 2 doors down that had been sitting unused for years. I have no particular feelings about that. He needed land and found some that was actually available. That is how these things are supposed to work. Gavin and I do not have what anyone would honestly describe as a close relationship. I want to say that plainly rather than wrap it in something tidier than the truth deserves. We see each other at occasions that require us to be in the same room. A birthday last spring for one of his kids. A dinner in January that Dennis organized with more optimism than the evening probably warranted. We are civil. We are careful in the way people are careful when they carry the full weight of a shared history and have agreed without ever saying so to let it exist in the background rather than the foreground. He has never apologized directly. I have stopped waiting for it, not from bitterness but from understanding that some people communicate remorse through changed behavior rather than stated words. Gavin's version of changed behavior has been to leave the building entirely alone. He has not made another move against the title, not tested anything, not sent anyone to walk the lot with a clipboard. For a man like Gavin, that kind of sustained restraint is its own form of acknowledgement. I have decided it is enough to work with. What surprised me more than any of that was Dennis. My father called me on a Wednesday evening about 8 months after everything resolved. He called with no specific reason, which was not like him. He asked how the building was going. I told him well. He asked if I needed anything. I said no. There was a pause long enough that I thought the call might dissolve into goodbye, and then he said I should have visited more. Not while she was sick. Earlier. When she was well enough that showing up would have meant something different. I held that sentence for a moment before I responded. Then I said yeah. He said he knew it didn't change anything. I said it didn't have to change anything to be worth saying. We talked for another 20 minutes about nothing in particular, and it was the longest conversation we had shared in years without a hidden objective underneath it. He has called 3 more times since. I call him back each time. It is not a transformed relationship and I am not pretending otherwise. But it is a real one, which is more than it was before, and I have learned to value the weight of small increments. Beverly stepped back from active practice at the end of last year. She still consults and takes cases that interest her, but she handed her regular client roster to a younger attorney and began spending more time at a lake house she and her husband had owned for 2 decades and almost never used. She came by Clement Street the week before she made the transition, and we sat in the front studio on 2 folding chairs with coffee and talked for an hour about Loretta and the building and what it means to construct something designed to outlast the person who builds it. She told me that in all her years of practice, the Loretta Ellery arrangement was among the clearest she had ever drafted, not in legal complexity but in clarity of intent. She said Loretta had walked into her office 6 years before she died and explained exactly what she wanted, exactly why she wanted it, and exactly who it was for without ambiguity or second-guessing. Beverly said most people in that situation spend half the appointment convincing themselves. Loretta spent the entire appointment planning. I kept the sign in the front window. The small handwritten one in Loretta's careful lettering that says alterations while you wait. Faded at the edges now but still readable to anyone who slows down enough to look. Several people have knocked on the door over the past 2 years assuming the tailoring shop was still running. I tell each of them we don't do alterations anymore but that June in Studio 2 is excellent and here is her card. 3 of them became her regular clients. I think Loretta would find that entirely fitting. There is an envelope in the desk drawer by the front window. The same drawer where I found the letter she left for me. Inside is a single photograph. Loretta and me, taken the summer I turned 16, standing outside this building on a day she had brought me downtown to help carry fabric samples. I am holding more boxes than I should and squinting into the sun. She is standing straight beside me, not squinting at all, looking directly into the camera with the expression she kept for moments when she was satisfied with something but had no intention of making a production of it. She placed that photograph in the shoebox deliberately, alongside the folder and the USB drive. I understood that the moment I found it. She wanted me to see it in that order after reading everything else so I would know it was not sentiment but a statement. Here is where we stood together. Here is what you were already carrying before it had a name. Here is what I saw when I looked at you and made my decision. I keep it in the drawer because that is where she would have kept it. Because some things belong exactly where they are, and moving them would be a kind of loss that has nothing to do with property. The coffee has gone cold. October light is moving down the front of the building slowly, the way fall light does in this town, like it has somewhere to be but is not in any particular hurry. June's machine is still running inside. That sound means someone is working and the work is good and the building is full and the morning has already started without waiting on anyone. I unlock the front door. I step inside. I start the day. If this story made you feel something, don't just scroll away. There are so many stories out there that never get told, and here on Confire Stories we bring them to life. So if you enjoy emotional real-life drama like this, take a second to subscribe and be part of the journey. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, or have a story of your own, share it in the comments. I read them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.